Good morning and hello everyone who's joining us either on Zoom or live on Facebook. I think I would like to get started because we have a very great first panel with many speakers, so I don't want to take time away from them. So yeah, very warm welcome for me to this symposium on the recognition and prevention of violence against LGBTQI plus persons on the move. My name is Nina Held. I'm a teaching fellow at the University of Sussex, and I'm also co-founder of the Queer European Asylum Network, or as we call it, QUEEN. Yeah, as a member of our network, I warmly welcome you to this second online symposium that we are organizing in 2020. The first one, you may have also joined that one that we organized in April, that focused on the challenges that COVID creates for LGBTQI persons seeking asylum. Today, this symposium focuses on the recognition and prevention of violence against LGBTQI persons on the move. And yeah, I had the distinct pleasure to work with a very dedicated team of members of the Queer European Asylum Network, as well as the panelists and performers yeah, that are speaking or performing today. And I would really like to thank them all for their hard work they put into creating this event. Especially from the Queen Network, I would like to thank Magdalena Müssig and Mohamed Dala from the Magnus Schierfeld Stiftung, who worked very hard in the background, especially for today's panel. We would also like to thank our generous supporters of our work and for this symposium, the Drei Linden Stiftung, the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism, the City of Heidelberg, the Federal Foundation Magnus Hirschfeld, and the Gunda Werner Institute for Feminism and Gender Democracy in Berlin. I would very, very quickly just like to tell you a little bit about the schedule today and remind you of some house rules. So the first panel of this symposium will discuss the Istanbul Convention in the context of queer asylum in the EU. And then the second panel discusses good practices relating to the prevention of hate-motivated crimes against LGBTQI asylum claimants in Germany. And then we have the pleasure to end with a performance by the UK-based human rights theatre group Ice and Fire. If you want to find out more about the speakers of the panels, go to our website, queereuropeanasylum.com. You can also follow us on Twitter on Queer Euro Asylum. We will be tweeting about the symposium using the hashtag Queer Asylum. The webinar is recorded and live streamed on Facebook, and we will make the recording available on our website later. In terms of questions being asked in the panels, we've disabled the chat function for security reasons. There's a question and answer function, and if you have any questions, please put them in, and we hope that we can address some of them later, but we already want to apologize if we won't have time. Yeah, and then you can also see below on the bottom, if you're joining on Zoom, we have a translation function. So if you prefer, if you prefer to switch the language, you can switch from English and German in the translation box. And there's also the option of muting the original language so that you can only hear the translated one. So now it is my really great pleasure to give the floor to Ines Kappert for the welcome remarks. Ines is the director of the Gunda Werner Institute, where she focuses on feminism, immigration, refugees and women, peace and security. She's also the author of the book Der Mann in der Krise oder konservative Kapitalismuskritik im kulturellen Mainstream. Thank you, Ines, for being here and for supporting our work.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nina, for this very nice welcome words. I'm very happy. I'm honored to support your work, and I'm very excited about this symposium today. Since 3 years, the Gunda Werner Institute has the possibility and has the honor to support this queer network that made all these serials of the symposiums possible that year. We focus on our game that queer persons on the move in Europe can exercise their rights and to make them more visible in their creativity with all their expertise, their stories, and their beauty. At the same time, we would like to remind political decision makers that they do have the possibility to make the lives of queer refugees much easier. They can. And thus we would like to win them to take their responsibility to implement the basic right to asylum and the basic right to belong. And what makes me personally very, very happy that despite all these hurdles and backlashes, this network gets stronger and stronger, and I'm very, very sure that they will continue to work next year, like to continue their tremendous work, and we will be happy to support again if wanted. So now it's time to thank also from my side to all these people who made it possible. And at that point, I also would like to thank Mohammed Dalla, who introduced us from the Gunnar Werner Institute, who connected us to this amazing network. And I also would like to thank Magdalena for all the organization work, and of course Mengia Tschalaer, who will also facilitate facilitate the first panel. Without her passion and expertise, I think nothing would have been possible as well. So it's again an honor to be part of this network. And Mengia, I'm happy now to hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ines, for these really, really generous words. I'm very touched by that. Thank you. To everyone else, a warm welcome also on my part. It is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the symposium as well as to this first panel. The first panel centers the Istanbul Convention on the prevention and combating of violence against women and girls, and particularly in the queer asylum context. The Istanbul Convention was drafted in 2011 by the Council of Europe and came into force in 2014. And as of today, the convention has been signed by all EU member states as well as the EU, and 6 member states still have to ratify the convention. And a part of them are Armenia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Moldavia, Slovakia, the UK, as well as the EU. So far, the Istanbul Convention is widely recognized as the most far-reaching legal instrument to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence. The idea for this panel arose from our own research that we do within our networks on lesbian identifying women seeking asylum in Germany who have experienced extreme forms of gender-based violence in their country of origin, during transition, during transit, and in Germany. The research has shown that the fact that sexual orientation and/or gender identity exacerbates violence against women within families, communities, and governmental setting, it is actually barely taken into account in the decision-making process. But indeed, lesbian asylum claimants in Germany are very likely to be denied refugee status despite the endured violence being protected by the Istanbul Convention. So in general, we know very little about how the Istanbul Convention is applied to prevent gender-based violence against LGBTQI persons. And we know even less about the relevance of the convention for LGBTQI persons on the move, which is again a particular vulnerable group who are very often subject to sexual and physical violence. So the aim of this panel is to bring into conversation the Istanbul Convention with asylum and refugee law and think about the ways in which the Istanbul Convention could be relevant within the queer asylum context. In so doing, this panel seeks to discuss the engagement, monitoring, and implementation of the Istanbul Convention as a legal framework on the level of the EU, the nation state, and within non-profit organizations. We will discuss the relevance and the life, so to speak, of the Istanbul Convention within different political, legal, and social settings, ranging from the European Parliament to LGA-Europe, the German ministries, as well as NGOs. So general questions that can be discussed are: how can we understand the struggle against gender-based violence in the context of SOGI asylum claims? Or how could we find ways in which to incorporate the Istanbul Convention more stringently in the context of the new Common European Asylum System? And as well as national legal and monitoring practices? And how could non-profit organizations make use of the Istanbul Convention to work towards the recognition and prevention of gender-based violence against LGBTQI persons? So my name is Mengia Tschalaer, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Bristol, as well as at the Brunel Law School, and I'm also the co-founder of the Queer European Asylum Network. And I have the immense pleasure today to moderate this panel with a fantastic lineup of speakers, which I would like to introduce to you now. May I ask you, the speakers, to switch on their cameras now so we can see you? Thank you. All right, so we have the Louise Hooper. She's an established public law, human rights, and migration lawyer at the Garden Court Chambers in London. And Louise has worked extensively with the Council of Europe as an international expert. This work has involved designing and developing offline and online training on the Istanbul Convention on combating violence against women and domestic violence, and conducting baseline country evaluations of compliance with the Istanbul Convention. And most recently, she wrote the guideline to gender-based asylum claims and non-refoulement, the Articles 60 and 61 of the Istanbul Convention. Welcome, Louise. We also have the pleasure to have Terry Reintke today in the panel. She's the Vice President of the Greens EFA Group in the European Parliament and the group's coordinator for the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. She is co-president of the LGBTI Intergroup and founder of the EU-UK Friendship Group. Terry Reintke was also featured in the Time magazine coverage for Persons of the Year 2017 as a part of the Silence Breakers speaking out against sexual abuse and harassment. We also have on the panel Akram Kubanychbekov. There is a senior advocacy officer at LGA-Europe and an independent umbrella nonprofit organization working towards human rights for LGBTQI persons in Europe and Central Asia. Akram works in developing and implementing advocacy strategies and policy initiatives aimed at bringing legal, political, and social change for LGBTI people across Europe and Central Asia, with a focus on hate crime and speech, asylum and migration, domestic violence, Eastern Partnership countries, and Central Asia. Akram is involved in LGBT activism since 2008. Welcome, Akram. We also have the pleasure to have Anna Mrozek on the panel. Anna works as an advisor for the German Federal Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth in the LGBTI unit. She previously was an assistant professor at the chair of public and constitutional law at the University of Leipzig. Her research focused on legal aspects of the supranational border regime of the EU, migration, humanitarian and human rights law, and correlations between law, politics, and culture. Thank you, Anna, for being here. We also have on the panel Yulia Serdarov. Yulia is an activist and anti-racist and queer feminist movements and worked in different NGOs. She currently works for NGO Letra, which I have mentioned before, works particularly on, or focuses on lesbian women claiming asylum in Germany. And last but not least, we have Jorge Maria Londoño. They is a non-binary and genderqueer trans activist from Colombia, who's based currently in Sweden. They were recently elected co-chair of TGEU, an umbrella organization for trans organizations and activists in Europe and Central Asia. And aside from their trans activism, they're also the chair of Youth Against Racism in Sweden. Welcome, Jose Maria, to the panel. Louise, I would like to start with you. You have worked with the Council of Europe and been involved in preparing the guidelines on the non-refoulement Articles 60 and 61 of the Istanbul Convention, which addresses gender-based violence in the asylum context. You are also a part of the GREVIO, which is the group of experts on action against violence against women and domestic violence.
Sorry, Mengia, sorry. Louise has a technical problem and will come back, so
okay,
I'll ask someone else.
For the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. Well, Louise would introduce us to the key provisions of the Istanbul Convention as they relate to migrant refugees and asylum-seeking women, and will identify some of the gender-sensitive measures proposed in the Articles 60 and 61, and tell us how these are applicable in queer asylum context. Louise, if you're able to connect with us now, may I ask you to take the floor?
I'm so sorry. My name's Louise Hooper. I'm a barrister at Garden Court Chambers, and I work as an independent expert with the Council of Europe, assisting with baseline evaluations, and have written publications for them about the implementation of Articles 60 and 61 of the Istanbul Convention. I hope I'm not repeating anything that's already been said. And I note from the introduction from Mengia that you're aware that the convention itself was adopted on the 7th of April and opened for signatures and then entered into force in 2014. To date, there have been 17 baseline evaluations completed. And during those baseline evaluations, where the implementation of the convention in various different countries is monitored, specific attention is paid to migrant and refugee women, which can include things like visits to reception and accommodation facilities, exchanges between state and non-state actors. And a big part of those monitoring processes is the NGO shadow reports and exchanges with civil society. In the first general report on GREVIO's activities, which covered the first 5 years, it was noted that there are some significant problems in respect of discrimination provisions, and in particular in relation to lesbian, bisexual and trans women. GREVIO stands for the Group of Experts on Violence Against Women, and the task of GREVIO is to monitor the implementation of the convention by states parties. It can also adopt, where relevant, appropriate general recommendations on general themes and concepts underlying the convention. Once the reports are complete, they go to the committee of the parties who follow up on the recommendations of GREVIO reports. The committee of the parties is the political arm of the convention, which consists of members of each of the states who have signed and ratified the convention. And it's also, it takes into account the recommendations that are made and will then follow up a couple of years later to make sure that those recommendations have been dealt with. The Istanbul Convention itself affects migrant women in 3 substantive ways. The first one is the non-discrimination principle, this applies the principles and standards of the entire convention to all women while present and resident in the host state. Specific provision is made for residence permits to be granted in a variety of circumstances, including where residence was dependent on a spouse or partner and that relationship has broken down. Specific provisions also made for gender-based asylum claims and a non-refoulement provision. So in terms of the non-discrimination provision, which is central and fundamentally underlies all of the other provisions of the convention, this is found at Article 4.3 and states, the implementation of the provisions of this convention by the parties, in particular measures to protect the rights of victims, shall be secured without discrimination on any ground, such as sex, gender, race, colour, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, state of health, disability, marital status, migrant or refugee status, or other status. And so it's quite important for the sorts of cases that we're talking about, because it explicitly includes sexual orientation and gender identity, and it specifically includes migrant or refugee status. And in doing that, it mirrors the development of the case law at the ECHR, looking at the rights to identity, both in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. Having said that, as I say, Grevio's identified several gaps in the implementation, and in particular non-discriminatory implementation, including in respect of LBT women. In the context of Belgium, as an example, it was specifically noted that countries failed to understand the intersectionality of different vulnerabilities. And in Turkey, there were very specific considerations given to the position of lesbian, bisexual and trans women in Turkey itself, facing high levels of prejudice and discrimination, making them vulnerable to various forms of violence, discrimination in accessing support and shelters, so service provision for victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence, and little information received about measures to address these issues, either in general policies or specific policies directed towards LBT women. The provisions within the convention itself that relate to women in the host country include all of the protection, support and assistance provisions, including access to shelters, access to NGO, counselling and assistance and accommodation, and include a variety of things like judicial measures to ensure fair trial. So taking into account the non-discrimination and its breadth, it includes all of the refugee, asylum seeking and undocumented women within a territory. In terms of people seeking asylum, the first provision on gender-based claims is Article 60, which has three main strands. One is to ensure gender-based violence is recognised as a form of persecution and a form of serious harm. And the convention itself sets out some definitions and also a series of types of crimes that must be considered serious harm and prosecuted within host states. Secondly, it requires a gender-sensitive interpretation to each of the convention grounds. And thirdly, gender-sensitive reception procedures and support services for asylum seekers, as well as gender guidelines and gender-sensitive asylum procedures, status determination procedures. In terms of gender-sensitive interpretation, possibly the most important one in the context of LBT women will be particular social group, but it's still important to recognise that it's not the end of an asylum claim or the end of a gender-sensitive interpretation of refugee grounds to stop at particular social group, because if you are, for example, a lesbian woman involved in organising and running protests, your claim might be based on your political activities as opposed to your sexual orientation or identity. And in that context, women who are LBT may face persecution on grounds of either directly because of their sexuality or gender identity, or because that's seen by other people as a political opinion or a manifestation of religion or non-religion. In terms of standards of protection, generally speaking, decision makers tend to downplay the risk of violence occurring and overestimate the likelihood of relevant protection being provided. So you get a double-ended pincer approach at denial of protections. In terms of the refugee standards, you would be looking at sufficient or effective protection, which is practical rather than theoretical. And one of the things that you could think about in terms of the Istanbul Convention is whether the standards set out in the convention about the levels of protection to be provided in the host state could be used as a guide to considering whether or not protection available in the country of origin is effective. That's not to say that if the standards are not met, then a person will qualify for refugee status. It's just a useful guide to the kind of thing that's necessary to enable women to obtain protection. Overall, it aims to remove the barriers to protection that face victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence, including provision of socio-legal support, overcoming shame, stigma, socioeconomic barriers, and gendered attitudes by officials. And these will often be compounded in the case of LBT women as a multiple form of discrimination. In terms of gender-sensitive procedures, good practice would include the provision to women of information on asylum procedures, the opportunity for separate interviews if women arrive in groups, the opportunity to raise independent needs for protection and their gender-specific grounds, elaboration of gender guidelines, and fundamentally training of all decision-making officials. We know that gender-based violence is often deeply rooted in social and cultural structures, norms, and values that govern society, all of our societies, not just the countries of origin that asylum-seeking women come from. We also know that trauma, stigma, shame, ostracism, and secondary victimization and fear are barriers to disclosure. The purposes of the provisions in the convention and the way that we've tried to elaborate on them in the publication, which I noted somebody's put in the chat, is to try and overcome these barriers and enable the stories to be told. Because if the stories are not told, the chances of obtaining protection are even lower. And as a consequence of failing to provide gender-sensitive asylum procedures, there's a real risk of refoulement because the women will not be able to tell their stories, be identified, or obtain protection. And in that context, bearing in mind late disclosure, which we're already quite familiar with in a gay asylum context through the cases of the TGEU, can be particularly problematic for women asylum claimants, particularly if it's taken as evidence of lack of credibility. And non-suspensive or accelerated procedures are often too quick to enable women to properly disclose or document their cases. Support services are required under Article 63 of the Convention, 60(3), to provide assistance in a gender-sensitive manner to asylum seekers, and that will include on grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity. And it's important to ensure that asylum seekers who are victims of gender-based violence receive psychosocial and crisis counselling, because again, this is important to enable and to be able to explain what has happened to them to decision makers. Gender guidelines is the final thing that's provided for, and these should cover both reception, accommodation, and asylum procedures themselves. And finally, in respect of non-refoulement, the provisions in the Convention reflect the general international law provisions on non-refoulement. And I like to conclude with a statement by a judge of the European Court of Human Rights who refers to Philippe Sands, saying that we have to understand personal stories. And what Lady Blancu said was, this lesson is very strongly reflected in the case of the non-refoulement principle, the idea of listening to and understanding personal stories, then deciding on them. That's non-refoulement in a nutshell. And in my view, the provisions that exist within the Istanbul Convention are designed to enable women and women with multi-sectional discriminatory difficulties to tell their stories in a way that gets them listened to and understood, so that those stories can be fairly determined in an asylum context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise, for this extremely comprehensive overview of the provisions, Article 1661 of the Istanbul Convention. And I think one of the difficulties that you have raised here, the challenges, is that we have an extremely firm and solid legal framework at hand with the Istanbul Convention, but very often it really is about the implementation of the latter that can create challenges. And I think a lot of the discussion we're having today will probably evolve around that particular gap between the law in the books and the law in action, so to speak. Terry, I would like to come to you and ask you the question, because you are at the European Parliament. You're a part of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and the Home Affairs, as well as the president of the LGBTI Intergroup. And I know that European Parliament welcomes the Istanbul Convention and has recently, as a coherent framework for combating gender-based violence, and has recently passed a non-binding resolution that urges all EU members to ratify this convention. So I'm wondering, could you tell us a bit more about the position of the European Parliament on the convention and the potential of cross-fertilization with LGBTQI equality efforts and legislations? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mengia, and first of all, thanks a lot for organizing this panel. I think also for me, it's going to be very stimulating now, starting with Louise's input on the specific provisions, because I think it's an absolutely crucial document, obviously, to move forward. I would like maybe, before I go into the European Parliament's position, a little bit speak about the political atmosphere that we are facing, because I think it's important to see, and we have this firm, very comprehensive, strong legal framework with the Istanbul Convention, but you also have to a little bit put it into a context. And I think when we look at the general political atmosphere, we face political backlash against LGBTI rights, against women's rights. We face political backlash against refugee rights. And we face political backlash against a multilateral rules-based order of international cooperation. And obviously, all of these aspects kind of cumulate in the Istanbul Convention in a way. And very often also the backlash is coming from similar sources of political actors, so to say. So that is why the Istanbul Convention has become a very controversial document. And when we look at the situation also in the European Parliament, unfortunately, we face a certain level of opposition. I will come back to that a little bit later. I think what needs to be noted, though, it's obviously that, as you said, Mengia, the European Parliament, with a really big, overwhelming majority, voted again and really comprehensively in favor of an EU accession to the Istanbul Convention, also urging all the member states to individually accede and ratify the Istanbul Convention. When I talk about a big overwhelming majority, I really mean it. It's going from the left to large parts of the EPP, the Conservative Party. So we are speaking about 2/3, even more, of members of the European Parliament. And this was always also including the aspects of having an inclusive and intersectional approach to the definition of gender inside of the Istanbul Convention, which obviously, as I said before, had been controversially discussed. But I think we took very progressive stances there in the European Parliament. And we also always said that is, as an international document, we want the European Union to accede to the full scope of the Istanbul Convention, because this is right now the really crucial question: which parts of the Istanbul Convention will the European Union actually become part of? There is a legal discussion ongoing. I will come back to that later. At the same time, while we have this strong support in the European Parliament, it's also obvious that not all member states so far, well, all member states have signed, but not all member states have ratified the Istanbul Convention yet. And we have basically 3 cases that are problematic because the ratification has been stopped, either by declarations in parliaments like in Hungary, or by rulings of constitutional courts, like, for example, in Bulgaria. And Poland, one of the member states in the European Union that has already ratified the Istanbul Convention, is threatening to leave it, or has repeatedly threatened to leave. High government officials have talked about this. So we see that there is a heated debate around the Istanbul Convention. I believe for us, obviously, we want the full accession, but we also, and I think when we talked about what Louise was talking about, what we really need is to mainstream the basis of what the Istanbul Convention means to other policy fields. And there, most notably also with regards to the topic of the discussion that we are having today, the migration policy of the European Union, because there actually we have an entry point where the European Union could do much more. I believe that there is now also an opening. We have the migration package on the table. Also there, very controversial discussion, very politicized over the past years. I think what can give us hope is actually when we look at the presentation of the LGBTI strategy. You might have been following it yesterday, where there is very specific mentioning also of the question of LGBTI applicants and how they can be better protected in a common European asylum system, but also a specific mentioning of having additional funding from the Asylum and Migration Fund going to organizations supporting these applications and the due process. So I believe that there is a possibility to do more, and the European Parliament, I mean, obviously we haven't voted on it yet, but looking at the voting record of the past, I think I'm very optimistic that we are going to support such proposals. And now looking at the Istanbul Convention, obviously mainstreaming it, but then what we have also always said is that we want to go beyond and make the fight against gender-based violence also integrated into EU law itself. So to have a a directive against gender-based violence on EU level, where then obviously also aspects of migration and asylum would have to be included in. So this would be even a further step that we would ask for. In terms of the ratification of the Istanbul Convention or the accession of the European Union to the Istanbul Convention, as you know, we are currently awaiting a legal opinion of the European Court of Justice that the European Parliament had asked for, basically regarding the questions of the scope to which the EU would accede to the Istanbul Convention. As far as I'm aware, we are hoping for this legal opinion to come in the beginning of next year. And from that, obviously, we hope to get a new dynamic and then to move ahead with the accession of the full European Union, notwithstanding, obviously, also hopefully, finally, a ratification by all EU member states. Now, let me end by maybe making two political points. The first one is, as you could see, when you look at the general political atmosphere, there is a lot of controversy, there is a lot of opposition. Very often this opposition is based on completely false claims, on really deliberate spreading of misinformation around the Istanbul Convention. And this is obviously regarding women's rights, LGBTI rights, refugee rights. Who stands behind this convention? So I believe it is absolutely important to stand up to this. I think we have a very clear, as Louise also outlined, legal framework and background here. So I think that it's always important to inform people also what is the Istanbul Convention and why it is important. And secondly, and I think that this is also kind of grounded also in the debates that we are having now, the Istanbul Convention really stands at the intersections of a lot of the struggles that we have in our societies. And I think it's one of the documents that really reminds us how important it is that we stay united in these battles. Because as I said, very often the people that are going against refugee rights, that are going against women's rights, that are going against LGBTI rights, and that are going against basically an international order that is based on conventions such as the Istanbul Convention, are coming from the same corner. And this is why it's so important that we don't start, dividing our struggles, but really stand together. And I think that the Istanbul Convention is one of the very important subjects there. And this is why I hope that we are going to continue upholding it, and then eventually, obviously for all EU member states, but also beyond that, the member states of the Council of Europe, to have a full ratification and then also a full implementation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Terry, for this really good overview of where we stand currently with the Istanbul Convention within the European Union. I think one aspect that you picked out was about the intersectionality of the legal framework, which is really important to our discussion today. And I would like to come to Akram, who works for ILGA as an advocacy officer. And because when we think about gender-based violence and the main focus of monitoring the implementation is actually a lot on women and girls. and also in the asylum context. So the Istanbul Convention also prohibits, as Louise has said, discrimination on many other grounds, including gender identity and sexual orientation. Maybe Akram, could you say something about the link between the Istanbul Convention and queer asylum? What are the challenges and where do we see these links, and how have they been realized so far in policy and activism? Thank you.
Yeah, now I think I'm unmuted. First of all, thank you for the organizers for inviting us to this important discussion. And when it comes to the broader application of the Istanbul Protocol, Istanbul Convention, is that this, as Louise and Terry highlighted, that this is the intersectional approach of the Istanbul Convention, and this is the definition of gender and others. So we should recognize that LGBTI people, and when it comes to Istanbul Convention, specifically LGBTI women, there have been many serious examples of the gender-based violence and domestic violence experienced by women and girls in asylum seeker, including against LGBTI women in Europe, country of origins, and in transit. And this double marginalization of the LGBTI women as based on the sexual, or sometimes triple or even more in intersecting identities, leaves them very, very vulnerable during their refugee or migration journey to the violence. And the Istanbul Convention specifically, by including the gender identity and sexual orientation as the protected as a non-discriminatory in the non-discriminatory principles, it gives broader framework for the legal protection of the LGBTI women. And why, for example, I also wanted to ask why the link between the Istanbul Protocol and the pure asylum might be missing so far, especially in the EU, is because, as I said, in the EU asylum system, there's a lack of intersectional approach in migration and asylum, and usually women or LGBTI people separately seen as homogeneous groups, and they're grouped by these identities, women or LGBT, and they're seen as by the EU law, they are seen as especially by the qualification directive and others, they're seen as separate groups, as I told before, and treated as a separate group. But the experiences are very different, and they should be the diversity among LGBTI and also women are very, very big. So, and that's why I think that this Istanbul Convention brings greater protection than what is existing at the moment within the Common European Asylum Framework. And then, and also it might be missing because of as I mentioned before, that EU already has its directives on asylum, which covers protection to vulnerable groups as women, children, and to some extent LGBT asylum seekers. And in addition, in some countries, gender-based violence and the SOGI, both as a form of persecution and ground for seeking asylum, is codified in their laws, national laws. We can note that in practice, even where it is codified in law, as you mentioned, Mengia, implementations very often remains insufficient and or inconsistent. Yeah, but this will be also, as Louise also told, might be true for the also Istanbul Convention because of this and that we are used to group people into homogeneous groups. This approach in practice and judicial system and asylum system are also represented by people who have these prejudices or understanding of the concepts. And we should admit that one undeniable plus of the Istanbul Convention, it furthers application of the intersectional lenses and recognize the structural inequalities and its effect on the refugee women. And so how would ILGA could contribute that as organization representing LGBTI people in Europe? ILGA could help support the EU institutions and the member states to understand how to apply norms of the Istanbul Convention to specifically to LGBTI women and LGBTI refugee women, migrant women, and to interpret the standards, although this is to support an interpretation and implementation. And also we can equip our members, because we are representing more than 600 organizations at 54 countries, to equip them with the skills and information needed to work on the implementation and the monitoring of how it is being applied on the ground. Yeah, I will stop here now, but if there will be more questions, I'm happy to answer later.
Thank you very much, Akram, for this really, really interesting way of highlighting the intersectionality, but also the diversity, I think, of experiences that we need to take into consideration when implementing and monitoring these legal frameworks. And I think with this, I would like to go over to Jorge Maria and ask Jorge Maria in terms of what are the specific trans experiences that you could particularly highlight here, and how does that perhaps differ from other experiences and that need special attention in terms of the Istanbul Convention? Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for organizing this event. The conversation so far has been really interesting, hearing to all of you. I would say that trans migrants or trans refugees are always in an extremely vulnerable position, especially since many of the trans migrants or trans refugees or gender diverse people are in the beginning of their transition while they start their migration process. When it comes to LGBTQI people in general, not speaking maybe about trans or trans women, I would say that they are also always vulnerable in the asylum process, since the European system is based on that you have the burden of proof to show that you're LGBTQI or trans enough or woman enough. So anything you do or say during the process of migrating to Europe can and probably will be held against you in the process of seeking asylum. And trans women in particular could expect, I would say, what I've seen from my activism, asylum activism and trans activism, violence in every step of the migration process, all the way from the origin country to the asylum centers in the reception country. And this violence is perpetrated by many different people, all the way from human trafficking to the asylum reception centers staff. It's not too uncommon to hear how trans women are hindered or not believed when they ask to live in a women's only housing, for instance, and when they're denied that, I would say that action is very violent against those trans women, not only because the state in some ways denying the right of self-identification and having the right to not be discriminated against, but also the fact that you leave that trans woman in a very vulnerable and violent position. I would like to speak some more also about the why. So why are we seeing this problem now, and why are we talking about it now? And I would say that a lot of discussions that have led us to this topic actually come from homonationalism and when feminism can be trans exclusionary, because we talk about the Istanbul Convention, and I I think also about this LGBTQI strategy presented by the Commission and, for instance, the Convention of the Rights of the Child. We have very strong rights. We have very strong protection, I would say, when it comes to basic human rights, especially for migrants, for women, and for girls. But we're also seeing a migration, a common migration and asylum reception system, which is standardized and created so that people are denied entry or are not allowed to stay in Europe. And this is colliding for me. How can we have these very strong rights and documents and conventions, and they mean so much, and they have this strength. Meanwhile, while we create a political system which tries to defy basically these conventions in many ways. So I'm not quite sure how to go about that problem. But that's something that I'm also thinking about. When it comes to also human rights being acknowledged or respected by receiving countries, the right to healthcare and gender affirming care are two basic rights that are not always met in member states when it comes to trans migrants or refugees. And a problem that I've seen in trans activism when it comes to asylum seeking as well is that after having hormone therapy or other gender affirming care, what can happen to your life if your asylum application is denied and you have to return to origin country and you've started to transition basically? What kind of threats can you expect if you're deported, for instance? And this is something that the union has to continue talking about, like the responsibility somehow that we assume when people enter our union, and the rights that we have told ourselves that we need to respect, acknowledge, and uphold. How do we do that when it comes to trans migrants and refugees for real? And how do we make sure that we don't leave them in a worse place that they were when they came to Europe? I think I'll wrap up there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jorge Maria. And I think what you particularly pointed out is also the way that states handle the reception of particularly gender non-binary and trans asylum claimants. With this, I think I would like to go over to Anna Mrozek. If you could switch on your camera, Anna. Thank you. To take kind of Germany as a case study in this. Anna, you work for the German ministry, and I was wondering, Germany has ratified the convention in February 2018 and is therefore obliged to comply with the monitoring set out in the convention as well. So can you maybe tell us a bit about how Germany is actually fulfilling such obligation, and how does this spill over into the asylum context?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to refer maybe to the previous statements, especially Terry's statement, who pretty much made us maybe aware, or states specifically how complex the system is here we are facing. We need to bear in mind that we have here a very interesting triangle, not only politically but also legally. We have the convention, the Istanbul Convention, that is part of the Council of Europe, and then we have the European Union, and then we have also the member states. And this is a complex, multi-layered system as in itself. And then we have this very interesting and very important convention. However, we need not to forget that it's an international convention with a status of an international convention. And this ratification status, for example, also for the German law, it has been ratified by, in Germany in 2018, and it gives the convention a status of a federal law. And this is something we need not to forget as well when we, of course, then look, for example, at the legal system which comes then from the European Union. as the directives or regulations, especially in regards then to the asylum system. So this is a very complex system we have there. And what comes on the top, and I think in this regard, this is even more struggling, is the complex political situation we are facing now in the European Union between the member states, especially, as Terry pointed out very correctly, in regards to the discussion on gender equality, and then when it comes to the protection of LGBTI people. And this all wrapped up in the bigger and also very complex discussion on the asylum system and also on international protection. So coming from there, I would like to refer now to your question in regards to the situation ratification in Germany. First of all, Germany is, I think, and this is something I can transport maybe, is that it has a positive, very positive approach towards the Istanbul Convention. It is regarded as a very important instrument, and it is taken seriously. I mean, prior to the ratification, the German state has already put some measurements in charge, and it has especially, for example, introduced the help hotline, the counseling hotline for violence against women, which is working quite well in the regard that it is giving support to women. This is one of the measurements. We had the reformation of some parts of criminal law regarding sexual offenses. And of course, and the other thing that has been improved is also the collection of data on domestic violence against women, especially. And this collection of data is actually a very important tool in order to enhance further measurements, be it legal, enhancing legal protection, or kind of go into a bit more, and actually possibly mostly important measurement in regards to the Istanbul Convention, strengthening the structure for support for women facing domestic violence. So, of course, financial fundings and a stronger and better structure of consulting structure and fostering causes for women facing domestic violence. So there is a safe space where women can go. And so this is something that has been enhanced, as you may know and realized, that Germany has actually introduced in September 2000, last September to September, the first state report, the Grievo report in regard to the Istanbul Convention. And without going there into detail, it's a long report. This report has, or the outcomes of the report, as such, it has been subject to criticism. I think the civil society had pinpointed exactly the points where Germany is still behind in regard also to fulfill its obligations in regard to the Istanbul Convention. And this is especially strengthening structures for women's safety. So in this regard, there is still space for improvement. And however, the Federal Ministry for Family Affairs, and specifically women, who is in charge of the measurements for Istanbul Convention, one need to say, not in charge, for example, of enhancing legal protection in regard to sexual offenses, and also not in regard to any reforms of asylum law. This is something that lies within the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. However, of course, the Ministry of Family Affairs is seeing the Istanbul Convention as a big priority, and is trying, to try to support wherever it can. And I think the first main measurement is the support of the structures and the financial fundings. And in regards to the political situation, definitely there needs to be a better idea and a better comprehensive approach, which kind of combines the federal approach and the approach within the German Länder to have a better structures. And now coming to the spillover to the asylum system, of course, As you may know, I mean, the Istanbul Convention has explicit regulations in regard on gender-based violence, in regard to asylum system, the Articles 59 following of the Istanbul Conventions. And you may also know that Germany has reservations to Article 59, especially Section 2 and 3 of that article. And this reservation will remain. It will also remain in the future. Reason being that, first of all, in regards to the status, residency status, if a woman is facing violence in the partnership, and the residency status has been granted according to the partner, that the woman keeps the status. This is something that has already been adopted in German law. That's why there is a reservation. However, the other paragraph, the Section 3, it is claimed, especially by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, that it goes beyond the legal status which is granted in Germany. And that's why it's a little bit of a contested matter. And as the other panelist has pointed out, within the asylum, the application of Istanbul Convention towards the regulations on granting international refugee protection and asylum is, it comes down to the interpretation of how much of LGBTI and granting asylum is protected by those regulations. So we hear now again at the question of gender and of the belonging of social group. And as Louise has pointed out explicitly, in regards to LGBTI asylum and the application of Istanbul Convention, it's explicitly the interpretation of the social group. So for the moment being, LGBTI people can seek protection, especially within this ground, belonging to a social group which is discriminated. However, it is also a matter of a burden of proof. We all know that it's very complicated, as the other colleagues have stated here. And this is a bit unfortunate, because I think we need to really pay attention that within this very complex regulative system of the EU asylum laws, which is going to be now reformed also, and the system of member states who are very strongly influenced now by the EU law. And then we have the Istanbul Convention, who is trying to have this impact on that as well. We really need not to forget that in this triangle, we do not lose the individual. And because this is always this is the danger that I do see, or kind of it's my personal opinion that we have created a strong system that is a little bit losing the needs of the individuals who are always, they are the ones who are then standing at the borders and claiming international protection. And this is very important. So just maybe to wrap it up, there is a positive approach in Germany to the Istanbul Convention. And especially the Ministry of Family Affairs is hoping and trying to influence, if it can, that also, of course, within the European Union, with the other member states do ratify this, that we have a common ground for the interpretation of the Istanbul Convention. This is politically contested. It's a difficult topic, but on our behalf, there's a positive approach to that, and we need to see how the European Union goes along with that. And maybe one more thing, of course, the LGBTI strategy, which is a huge step forward to enhance LGBTI rights on the European Union level. It does state positively international protection in regard to LGBTI people. We have those statements there. However, and this is the interesting thing, it does not mention the Istanbul Convention. This is a reason being that the European Union has a legal problem with signing the Istanbul Convention, as we all know, which goes back to the problem if the European Union can be part of the European Convention of Human Rights or the Council of Europe at all. And so you see how the development is there, and we hope that there will also be a positive outcome on this. However, the strategy there has some, we hope we will have some very positive impact on including LGBTI people in the international protection. However, I hope it's not too vague in this regard. So so maybe so far.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think it's great to see that Germany is definitely one of the states that supports the Istanbul Convention full-fledgedly. But I also think it's concerning to see that still, that particularly in the asylum context, the Istanbul Convention seems to weaken a little bit the implementation and application of this legal instrument. And I think this speaks to also what Jorge Maria has said and Akram, that, you know, that there is a sort of a clash between gender equality or approaches to gender-based violence, as well as politics and policies that are geared towards asylum and migration and immigration. And I would like, with this, I would like to address the next question to Julia. Julia works for an amazing organization called Letra in Munich, and particularly supports lesbian identifying claimants in making their asylum claims. And I think one of the things, Julia, that we always have discussed is the invisibility, particularly of lesbian women within the asylum context, particularly also within the queer asylum context, and that particularly the violence that we see that these women have endured, so to speak, remains often unrecognized within the asylum context. And I think this ties in again also with Jorge Maria and Akram have mentioned before. Julia, maybe could you tell us a little bit more about your experience working with lesbian identifying women, and particularly the sort of violence that they have endured, and how this ultimately contributes or does not contribute to their endeavor to gain refugee protection in Germany? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Mengia, and thanks a lot for organizing and also for inviting me on that panel, and for all of the speakers for joining. I will try to keep it really short because I think we will maybe not even have time for a long second round. So, and like, I think there are many things that have been mentioned before by the other speakers. So, well, yeah, first of all, there are like many different forms of violence that lesbian, bisexual, queer women experience. Like in Letra, the organization I'm working for, we also counsel trans people, but I would say the vast majority are really like lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. So I think I will relate mainly to their experiences. And like the various forms of violence that they experienced are like, on the one hand side, like violence that women in general experience, women on the move and in their home countries, such as like rape in their families, beatings, so-called domestic violence, but then also so many forms of violence which they experience just specifically as lesbian women because of their sexual identity. And this is, as an example, like so-called corrective rape, where like members of their families or communities would rape them to like make them straight, and also as lesbians from their families, they are forced into marriage, forced into heterosexual lives, and then when they try to leave the country, often they also get victims of human trafficking. And also, we shouldn't forget the violence that they experience once they arrive in Germany, because I guess all of you know that people are accommodated in these big centers in Bavaria, especially in these anchor centers, which are like not queer-friendly environments at all. And yeah, and well, like all of these experiences of violence, they are it's often just impossible to bring them in their asylum claims. These are like many things that Louise Hooper just mentioned in the beginning, that it's often a big obstacle to bring these stories of violence, these experiences, to just mention them in the interview, in the asylum hearing, because it's a big difficulty, first of all, to speak their own sexual identity, as they come from very homophobic environments, plus being accommodated in very hostile environments where maybe even people from their own language communities tell them that being a lesbian is also in Germany forbidden. So this is a big problem, that in the first asylum hearing, people are just too afraid, too ashamed in this hierarchical setting of the interview to open up and to speak about it. And most are also not so lucky to meet before the asylum hearing an organization such as ours, but also many others, to inform them about the rights in the asylum hearing. For example, that they can ask for a female translator and a female staff from the federal office. And then even if people manage to speak about these experiences of violence because of their sexual identity, there is a big problem in putting what they have experienced in somehow a chronological narration, which is accepted by the federal office. Because people are heavily traumatized, and there is like so much scientific research on the effects of trauma on the brain, and that it's such a big impossibility to put things in a chronological order when people experience traumatizing events. But still, this is what is expected in court and in the federal office in the hearing. Apart from that, what we have seen, like in the last 1 or 2 years, that in court and in the federal office, what is used more and more is like a certain questionnaire about homosexuality, which follows a certain model of coming out. It's a very stiff model, which, like I say, the very diverse experiences, life experiences of people regarding their coming out is like not fitting in this model. Like not of all of these stories can be put in this model, so people really struggle to answer these questions. So these are so many difficulties during the court hearing, during the hearing, during the asylum interview, why many of these experiences, which are so important, which are actually asylum reasons, are not even in the protocol, not in the minutes. And then when it comes to the decision about the asylum claim or about the court or about the court decision, like so many forms of violence that I have named in the beginning, most of the time they're not even asylum reasons. So like, let's say I was speaking about rape within the families, I was speaking about beatings, mob justice, maybe people have experienced murderers of their partners, of their beloved ones. And what we see in the rejection letters is what counts as valid asylum reasons for the federal office is most of the time like state persecution. And most of the women that come to seek for counseling at our organization are from Uganda. So speaking of Uganda, for example, when it comes to these forms of violence that I have just mentioned, which is not state violence, Germany is saying, well, that Uganda has a working juridical system, and if they were victim of violence, they can just turn to the police, which is of course not possible, because if they were beaten up by their families or raped because they are a lesbian, the police would of course start investigating and then find out about that. And then when it comes to state persecution, also there, what we always read in the rejection letters is that like the mere existence of laws persecuting LGBTIQs is actually not enough. These laws need to be put into practice, into force. So to bring it to the point, if people were in Uganda like excluded from their communities, excluded from their families, beaten up by their families, and if they haven't waited to be imprisoned, then this is often not enough to be granted refugee status. And then even the people who have been imprisoned and who try to bring evidence, court papers, whatever about that, police papers, the burden of proof was mentioned many times before. Even in these cases, most of the time the evidence is not believed because it might not fulfill certain formal standards, which Germany is expecting also Ugandan police to fulfill. So this is like a big problem. People are in general not believed, so people get rejected and fear deportation, and through all of that violence, these people experience, lesbians and bisexual women is just made invisible. And so I can very much, just to close that, I can very much feel this incomprehension and maybe even anger that Jorge Maria mentioned before, that there is this very strong convention which is actually so much supporting women and LGBT and lesbian rights, and then like the people working on the ground see such a different reality. So I think it's still such a very, very long way to go. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. I think what this discussion right now has shown that the Istanbul Convention really has many different lives in many different contexts. We have seen, Terry, you have mentioned the political life of the Istanbul Convention, which has caused some rupture within the EU and is a heavily contested document politically. And I think, Louise, you have pointed out particularly the legal aspect of the Istanbul Convention, and how the applicability within the asylum context from a letter perspective, so to speak. But also you have pointed out the lived experiences that go with such a convention and the manner in which these very individual experiences can or cannot be grasped within such a legal framework. And I think this is where Akram and Jorge Maria also come in, pointing out that although the convention has a very firm commitment to intersectionality and is indeed a very strong legal framework, there is so much work to do to kind of bring it into coherence with the lived realities that we experience on a daily basis, and particularly also with the vulnerabilities that LGBTQI persons on the move face. And I think, Julia, you have very nicely pointed out the particular forms of gender-based violence that, in your case, lesbian identifying claimants experience, and how these remain often unrecognized within such a legal context. And going to Anna, I think, Germany is one of the countries that has shown how to implement and monitor the Istanbul Convention with setting up firm systems such as hotlines and collecting data, making sure that gender-based violence becomes visible within a political context as well, and how can we address this as nation states in order to support women who are victims of or survivors of gender-based violence. But in all this, I think there are obviously a lot of challenges that lie ahead in the years to come. And I think my final question to all of you, so if you could all switch on your cameras again from the panel, if you haven't done so yet, which is also a question that has been raised by one of our attendees, is like, what are the fundamental steps going forward to raise awareness within European society as well as on the local level and the EU level to fulfill the rights and needs of LGBTQI refugees and asylum seekers going forward? And I just open the floor at this point. I think you have all about a minute to answer the the questions of what your future steps and endeavors would be before we close this session in 10 minutes. Thank you. I say just hop on your mics and feel free to jump in.
Okay, I just jump in quickly. I think it shows, the discussion really shows that the convention, it has stirred up once more a political discussion, and it has the power to do that because it's tackling the issue of this violence against women, and also, and this is clear, including LGBTI people. And I think this is important to put it out. And I think the reports are actually a very important instrument because once they're put out there, they are being discussed. And of course, the reports need to include all these facets. They need to have an intersectional approach of the application of the Istanbul Convention. And once this is brought up, there is a discussion on that, at least. And a discussion always causes something that maybe can cause also legal regulations or something, a movement. We can move forward with something. And I think this is a very important step, that the member states who have ratified this convention do exactly that they pinpoint the issues and report on them, and that we can talk about this, and at least a step forward in this regard.
Thank you. Yes, Akram, and then Louise.
Yeah, I think that here, when it comes to violence against women and against LGBTI people and those at the intersecting, the main, I think here main issue, because even the EU directives are perfect, almost perfect. And I think here's the problem, is the main problem is the implementation at the national level, because we can add another convention and another, because, for example, the EU member states, they are members of the also the CEDAW, and CEDAW also protects, and etc. But I think here that what Commissioner Dalli yesterday just highlighted, that this should be the rigorous application of already existing legal framework at the national level, and also raising awareness of judiciary, asylum officers. So this would be the first steps to move forward, because at this moment, with the complex situation around the Istanbul Convention, we cannot expect that it will be better implemented than already those who are agreed, and there is no controversy around it. And yeah, my main point is this is the first, this awareness raising and implementation of already existing legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Akram. I'll give now the word to Louise and then Jorge Maria.
Thank you. From a Council of Europe perspective, because I'm very much here in my Council of Europe hat on, make sure your state has signed and ratified the convention. If it hasn't, use the provisions of the convention to require awareness raising, Article 13, education, Article 14, and training of professionals at Article 15. Implement the convention if you're a state official, force your state to do it if you're a lawyer or other NGO. NGOs in particular should have a look at the provisions relating to cooperation between states and NGOs and adequate funding for NGOs involved in these kind of areas, and see whether those provisions are being complied with. And most fundamentally of all, from the Council of Europe perspective, get involved in the monitoring process, and through the use of things like shadow reports, explain what's not working, so that that can then be looked at and recommendations made. Because if the monitoring missions and the monitoring mechanism is not aware of the failures, it can't make recommendations to the committee of the parties, who then look at the recommendations and monitor their implementation.
Thank you very much, Louise, for this very concise catalogue of steps to take. I hope a lot of people are listening right now. Please, Jorge Maria, and then Julia.
Thanks. So listening to what Julia have said, I can see that the legislator really hasn't taken into account these complex intersections we're talking about, lived realities. Somehow the convention is inefficient for Black women, trans women, etc. I would see that this is a very clear evidence of how these different oppressive systems cooperate, how systematic racism together with LGBTQI phobia cooperates. Many evidence have been brought up as well when it comes to the proof of burden. And when I talk to trans and gender diverse people of color who suffer in the asylum process, or even the European asylum system, they can't always separate what is LGBTQI phobia and what is simple and raw racism. And I think that's should be a warning for us, that this convention, when it comes to putting it into operation by a member state, is inefficient. So What I would like to do is to turn to the legislator and ask them to recognize the complexities of these intersections, addressing systematic institutional racism that hinders people of color to be believed in, holding both politicians and agencies accountable, I would say, is very important. A lot of the problems we're talking about are on the agency level, Migration Board, for instance. Louise, you mentioned something about shadow reporting and complaint mechanism. That's also a very important tool for us to hold politicians and institutions accountable when it comes to this convention. And also working multilaterally with several human rights topics could be something that I think about, while not forgetting specific rights such as women's rights or trans rights.
Thank you very much, Jorge Maria. I would like to give the word now to Julia, and then Terry, I would give you the final word if you agree. But today we have to wrap up, unfortunately, in 3 minutes. Julia, it's your turn.
All right, just one sentence regarding raising awareness. I would say we have to aim at the decision makers within the federal office. We have to aim at the judges, like the officials who take decision on asylum claims, on court cases, and to tackle their stereotypes, their stiff images of life stories of people of homosexuality, etc. And make them listen to NGOs, to activists working on the ground, NGOs, activists working, campaigning in the home countries where people have fled from. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Terry, may I give you the last word of today's panel?
Yeah, I'll try to be super short. I think, first of all, I mean, maybe also looking from a European perspective, we have to counter the lies, because there are so many misconceptions, both on the Istanbul Convention as well as on, asylum procedures, what is happening there, why are people claiming asylum. And I think that it's important, especially the work that Louise is doing, but also all of you, to really stand up to these lies and misinformations that are just being spread. And then I think, secondly, like, create and tell positive stories as well. So where have things worked? Because we are very often in a position where, which is completely right, we criticize the things that are not working. But what I would need is also to say that countries that have ratified and really implement the Istanbul Convention, it's working. It has positive influences on the way things are being done. Then looking for allies, I think that sometimes you also have to look for a little bit maybe unobvious allies, like religious communities, where maybe you can have an access and talk to them, especially with regards to refugee rights. There have been some openings there where I think we should look also, to get in a different set of people maybe than the people that we usually talk to. And then lastly, obviously make noise. Like, if you're from a civil society organization, if you're a citizen, wherever, talk about the Istanbul Convention, talk about the advantages that it has, talk about that it's needed again and again, say what a big problem we still have with violence against women, with violence against LGBTI people, with violence against refugees, what kind of experiences they are facing, and that we need to do something. Because as legislators, I can tell you, with the migration package coming up now, if we don't have people really pushing for something progressive to come out of this, I mean, we have all the people in the streets that are, spreading racist bullshit and lies. If we don't have the counterparts, it's very hard for us to get anything done also on a legislative level. And then obviously the same is true for the Istanbul Convention, and then a potential directive against gender-based violence. Without this noise, it's more difficult for us. So I think we have to try to create it together.
Thank you very much, Terry. And I think that's a really, really good way to end, on the note that we have to push. We cannot give up. We have to remain visible within all different kinds of contexts. And I know that for many, that's not an easy thing to do, by no means. In terms of good practices, Terry, thank you for mentioning that. I think the next panel that will be starting shortly in 15 minutes is actually about discussing the good practices relating to prevention of hate motivated crimes against LGBTQI persons on the move in Germany. So I all invite you to also come and attend our second panel, which will start at 10:45. And I am kind of sad to wrap it up so abruptly here. I would really like to thank you again, everyone, to be here and to join this really fascinating conversation. And I'm aware that this conversation is a start of hopefully many more conversations around the topic to come, many more questions to be raised, and many more visions to be framed around the same topic on the Istanbul Convention and queer asylum. Thanks again all for those who have come and attended the panel via Zoom or the live streaming via Facebook. And we hope to see you all again soon in one of our events. Thank you so much, and have a good day.